now. And it's streaming. So I'm going to start letting people in.
Good everyone. Welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion, CLGS, here at Pacific School of Religion. We're thrilled to have you with us today for the first offering of our 2021-2022 academic year from our Latinx Roundtable, Fe, Familia, Igualdad. And so I'm honored to introduce the coordinator of that roundtable, who will then introduce our speaker for today. So I introduced you, Carla Roland.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Carla. I'm the coordinator of the Latinx Roundtable of the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. And as Bernie mentioned, this is the first in a series for the 2021-2022 year. Our website, fefamiliaigualdad.org, has our resources, and these can also be reached through the CLGS.org website. We're really excited that you're here. The event is being recorded and streamed on Facebook. In a little bit, after Professor Dávila finishes their presentation, we'll have an opportunity for questions and conversation. Again, so excited that you're here today. The title of the conversation today is Mental Health Care and Latinx Theology Activism, and our guest speaker is MT Dávila. MT is Associate Professor of Practice Practice Religious and Theological Studies at Merrimack College in Andover, Massachusetts, a Roman Catholic laywoman, and is globally known for her work in Catholic theological ethics. MT teaches, mentors, preaches, and writes in the areas of public theology, migrant and racial justice, the use of force, and social justice from the lens of the preferential option for the poor. In this queer Latinx faith conversation, MT explores connections and intersections between the promotion and cultivation of mental health for all persons and the Christian call to activism in the public square. So welcome, MT. I'm really excited to hear what you have to offer today. Thank you for being with us.
Sure. Well, thank you for the welcome, and hello to folks, and hello to friends that we haven't seen each other in so long, but the love is there. So I am very glad to be here. I'm also very glad to be here addressing the topic that Carla and I sort of fused together. It's sort of an emerging topic of scholarly writing for me, but like many things queer and many things in the academy, and certainly many things with mental health, it comes from vast experience, unfortunately, perhaps in some cases and not. So I want to just take this time where I get to present to you something, and then listen to your voices and your questions and have more of a dialogue, to just let you know where I am in looking at some of the intersections that Carla mentioned, where I come to this, and with the permission of the affected persons, is having spent the last 3 years, actually more than that, if you count different children, taking care of the mental health of 2 of my children in particular, but really all of them, with several challenges, some critical and others less so. Having to deal with what that looks like in a queer landscape for youth, especially, but as a parent as well. And then as a Latina and as a theologian, and as someone who likes to produce public theology and likes to engage these sort of critical questions at the level of what does it mean for churches, communities, institutions trying to look at a problem at the same time and in a productive way. What does that look like? It's amazing. I wrote something for a conference in Sao Paulo that's taking place starting next week. And of course, I'm just going to be in it virtually. And the piece is about resistance to Laudato, to Amoris Laetitia, which is a document that came out of the Vatican on love and family, right? It was a big synod on the family a couple of years ago, well, actually more than a couple of years ago. And the document that came out of it, you may have heard some of the hoopla around it, which had to do with places where Pope Francis may have left a little room for Catholic communities, Catholic priests giving communion to divorced and remarried couples, if that remarried couple really wanted to enter into the full life of the church. That was one of the pieces of that document, so in case you want to make that connection. And I was asked to speak about resistance to that document. And I said, it's not so much resistance, it's incongruence. And so one of the pieces that I've found in navigating mental health care, wellness, wholeness within a queer family and as a Latina and as a theologian is the incongruence of the awareness of the church and the attention of the church. And now here I'm speaking beyond the Catholic Church, so not just Catholic, but into other traditions, of the actual crisis that mental health care represents and mental health care challenges represent for the life of the church, but for society in general. So just to give you a couple of numbers, globally, so the World Health Organization states that globally, 1 in 4 families is impacted by some form of mental health challenge and will experience a mental health crisis in the family that will impact the family unit, its well-being in many different dimensions, economic, social, and spiritual, significantly. Of course, that number was before the pandemic. So if we add to that the impact of the pandemic, a lot of us have seen those numbers, what those numbers are in the US, that becomes a much more critical issue. And so my question has always been, where was that class in seminary? When we were going through and getting our MDivs and getting our MTSs, preparing for ordination, we took pastoral care, right? We have degrees in pastoral care, and those typically have some form of mental health, mental development mainly is what those courses address. They don't necessarily address pathology at all. Where was that? Why is there such an incongruence with what I think is one of the biggest challenges to families in the contemporary world, globally, but certainly in the US, and the life of the church, especially the ministries of the church and the care of the church for families, right? If most of our church traditions hold that the family, shaped in many different forms, is the primary church, right? The domestic church, and that place where the human being begins to become and learns to become and fully develops all elements that impact mental health care greatly. How come there's this divorce between attention to this very serious concern? One of the pieces, education is at the center of it, right? So there's so much stigma associated with mental health care, mental health challenges and crises, that there is often not enough knowledge in our parishes, in our churches, in our national church bodies, in our governing bodies, and therefore in our seminaries, there is not enough awareness and knowledge of the level of impact. What do I mean by level of impact? We may have a course, for example, we may include in a course the impact of, say, alcoholism on a family system. But we don't necessarily think about the impact of a ongoing mental health challenges, personality disorders, etc., on a life of a family. Typically, a feeling that is reported by many families, and certainly I've seen it, is abandonment, that we feel that we become invisible, right? I belong to some support groups and have taken some courses taught by teachers who focus on family and mental health care. And one of the things we say is like, no one brings us a fucking casserole, right? Like, we go through a crisis and that dimension in our lives is completely invisible. It's invisible in our places of work. It's invisible in our churches and in our parishes. And so there's a feeling of abandonment, and there's also, and with that goes isolation, right? So those places where we would go for support, spiritual, social, our friends circle from our churches, they start eroding, they start falling away, deepening the crisis in many instances. The other piece that I want to talk about is the economic impact. And again, a lot of my work has been focusing on families, siblings, families, children, how parents deal with children, the issue of how do you manage resources in a home when you have to focus so much of the resources, both financial and spiritual and psychic, on the particular needs of one child. But the financial strain and the financial drain on a family is really significant. The loss of income is significant, and we can consider, and we know about, and we talk about in our churches about the loss of income that happens again when a family member gets Alzheimer's or gets cancer or dementia or some other long-term illness that removes a breadwinner from the work environment. But we're not as aware of when that happens due to mental health crises. So the financial strain also becomes huge. And again, education and awareness and a willingness to, it's one thing is to say education, another thing is to say overcoming the stigma to educate. Because it means overcoming this hurdle that is there, where we think these are matters that must be kept private. To focus a little bit on the Latino community, and especially my experiences Latino Christianity and my studies with Latino Christianity, this is very problematic. Among Latino Christians, the question of mental health care, and especially migrant families, is one that carries a very high stigma. When that problematic or that challenge is queered in any way, the stigma grows. So that the ability of that family to begin to look for resources in an incredibly inadequate market of supply of mental health care at any age group, but pediatric is horrific. And then outside of the US, even worse. Those are very, very heavy strains on Latino families, very heavy strains. And again, the numbers confirm we're not exempt, right? We may think, oh, well, that's a problem. That's a white people's problem. Many people will say that, right? Black families will say, well, that's a white people's problem. And it's not, right? The numbers are confirmed across the board in a general way, 1 out of every 4 families. So if we look at our seminaries, if we look at our faculty, right? If you have a faculty of 15 faculty members, and you have a student body of 200 students, you got to do the math. And you got to wake up and think, okay, what's missing here? How do we make this a conversation that is not voyeurism, that is not exhibitionism either, right? So try to avoid those two polarities. Sometimes when you break the stigma around a particular conversation, that can be a tendency, right? That you move toward voyeurism or exhibitionism. But really make it be a productive conversation for the kinds of programming that a seminary can undertake. Because for many Latino families, their pastors are the first line of contact for many health questions. It's one of the reasons in Black and Latino neighborhoods, rates of vaccination, for example, against COVID-19 go up when the pastors become involved in vaccination campaigns. It shouldn't be any different with respect to mental health care. The other piece that I'm bringing to the table is that I am currently struggling in my family unit, and was like this close to calling Carla and being like, Carla, I can't do it because I got to run from here to here, make appointments, take phone calls from doctors, from this, from that, make sure that everyone is safe in my home. And again, it's that loss of connection, of the connectedness, loss of employment, loss of a professional opportunity. These families are surrounded by loss and abandonment. That really is the challenge to the churches. We can't become clinicians, all of us. That's not going to be our role. The role is more of an active accompaniment, so that abandonment doesn't become another lens by which these families engage. Facilitating meals, facilitating the buildup of maybe an account that families can access when funds grow very low or non-existent because the breadwinner is hospitalized for a lengthy period of time. Providing follow-up with children when there's children involved. And then also making sure that we are clear on the connection between queer families and some of these mental health struggles. It becomes, the intersections there triple. And there's sort of so much awareness in many of the circles for certain groups to express themselves, to speak out, to be vocal, and to offer support. But on the other hand, that other dimension, that mental health dimension, so the queer part gets sort of attention and perhaps openness from, depending on what church tradition the family is embedded in, but the mental health part gets put away. And with the complication that this intersection can lead pastors to continue to perpetuate the myth that queerness is a mental health problem, when the dynamics are very, very different and very complex. So there is ample room for seminaries for pastors to get actually just very little education. It doesn't even mean going very far, but perhaps joining, or I should correct it, not making it so that there seems to be an incongruence between a church's teaching on the family and the experiences they're living, between a church's ministry to families and the experiences they're living. That's really a more direct place. I think schools are a tricky subject. That's such a big industry, public education and mental health care within public educations, that I think the role of the churches becomes a lot more effective in the local churches, doing that one-on-one family and neighborhood accompaniment and care, and making sure that families don't feel invisible when they're struggling. So that's a little bit of an introduction, a little bit of a conversation started. I think Kyla has some questions, but there might be other questions around. And then we can, I mean, I'm an ethicist by training, right? So there are some critical dimensions, systemic dimensions that are brought into this, just both with respect to supply of care and access to providers, but also how different systems, both racial immigration systems, even how capitalism itself and a market economy contribute to some of these problems.
Thank you, MT. My brain is going a mile a minute now. If I can first ask you a question that's structural. So you mentioned the Love and Family document from the Vatican, and in terms of, and you brought up the issue of divorce and remarriage, and as a negative effect on what I think you've presented, and this is just a provocation for my part, is that it seems that the church is divorcing itself from certain families. So there's such issues with divorce within the church in terms of its membership, but we don't always explore church divorcing itself from the needs of certain families. So that I'm thinking of it in terms of a structural thing and in terms of what we teach. The second part, which is another structural going into your ethics piece, it sounded to me in the financial piece of this, it sounds to me like the reason why we want to get rid of bail programs for non-violent offenders, because the financial ruin of a person who can't pay, $100 fine, gets incarcerated and then loses a job because they miss work, and they miss work for court dates, and they miss work for all these things. It just creates a cycle that far outpaces the original infraction, whether proven or not, right? So that idea that we create spiral financial loss based on one gap in the system being able to provide help, and then it just spirals. So it's another way of responsibility of the institution absolving itself from the responsibility. In this case, in both cases in mental health, one in saying, well, your family has that, we don't deal with that. So it's sort of like we're divorcing from that. And then we're not going to support you in any of the ways in the example that you made was the financial. So that's just a provocation. I don't know if you have a response to that, and hopefully it makes sense.
Well, it's definitely the case that a lot of the interaction that many people have with the criminal justice system surface from mental health crises, whether it's addictions, family structures of different sorts that get impacted. And so you have patterns that emerge that can be violent or that disturb the peace or that disturb someone else's idea of what the peace ought to look like. Police get involved, right? And so a big piece of at least the prison abolition angles or groups that I'm associated with are groups that are really looking at that mental health piece more closely. That we have to demand that before a city or a county decides to build a new jail, that it deals with the mental health crisis that has caused over 60% of the population of the current jails to be there. And see how, like, all the different elements that join in, because there's a lot of it that is racial. There's a lot of it that has to do with language when you're talking about migrant communities and you have a mental health crisis in a migrant community and police appear from a 911 call and there is no translation to try to say, well, de-escalation training would be one of the tools, and for, say, pastors to be able to advocate in their towns for that kind of training would be one of their tools. But that has to go hand in hand with translation programs. Even more yet, having officers and employees on the payroll that can speak and be present for those communities. So definitely that's one structural piece, the notion of how our police systems are being trained, what are the current populations on that are jailed, and even how is it that we begin to fund our jails or build new jails. And I'm in Massachusetts, so currently in Massachusetts, some of the decarceration efforts right now are targeting a town close by that has on its agenda to build a new women's jail. And the numbers are very, very similar between women incarcerated because of a mental health crisis and men. So the question is, why is that money going to a new jail and not to mental health services? Mm-hmm. Especially when in Massachusetts, in the Boston area, we have the evidence, direct evidence, that before the pandemic, there was a bridge to a particular treatment center, addiction treatment center, that was closed because of structural concerns, and with no plan to rebuild the bridge, number one, and no immediate plan to relocate the services that addiction center was offering. Well, the relationship between that, which was really a structural engineering policy concern, if in some people's mind, the relationship between that and a rise in 911 calls for public disturbance on the other side of the bridge, because now these people who would receive care, addiction care, are not receiving it. There's a direct correlation. So there's elements there structurally that we can't close our eyes to. And that operate very much on a very local level, because police departments are a very local question, and that also operate on a national level.
Why do you think, do you think that if mental health issues was only a white issue, that the church would take it seriously? Or is it, is it like the opioid stuff, when it's affected different communities, it's garnered different attention? How do you think it's the pathologizing of gender, of queerness, that puts it on the same level? Gender, queerness, mental health become these categories, and everything else is like social justice, right? Race, Catholic activism in that regard, within that tradition and other traditions, but somehow gender, sexuality, and mental health become the frontier untouched. And the incongruency, to use your word, that has to do with, in our own communities, Latino communities, in church communities where we value so much family as being the unit, and yet this may in fact be one of the most critical aspects. What's the, excuse me, tell me something, what's the history of this? Why is it on that side of the ledger and not on the other?
Sure. I would say, I would add intimate partner violence to that list, right? So it's not just the gender piece and queer piece, but when you begin to talk about mental health, I would add intimate partner violence. Why are these topics divorced? And I like your use of that. Or why does the church sort of absolve itself from caring for families or having particular ministries that attend to the pain that these families are suffering? I think it's because the gender piece can be one. It's not fully it, right? Because the church gets involved in very gendered questions that it considers important, such as reproductive health, right? And reproductive health care. So that doesn't explain it all. I think really is that the church is traditionally, and so we're looking at the history, is limited in its ability to perceive a family, to see fully what is a family. You're talking about centuries and centuries and centuries of single men developing ministerial pastoral practices that are still being used, right? And so there is a menu. If I stick to the Catholic tradition, that we have the manuals, the moral manuals, and these were literal manuals, thick tomes that would be opened up, and when someone went to confession, the priest would kind of go through the menu and be like, oh, okay, here's your sin, right? And those never touched on things that were not considered sin, but that are still part of the brokenness of the human family, right? We wouldn't consider cancer a sin, right? I mean, there's structural reasons why cancer might be a sin in a region that is polluted and where you have toxic dumping and things like that. That's a different question. But mental health care, the question is like the same question as the preferential option for the poor, where the first element of the poor is the materially poor, which is considered a sin against God's will. So I always ask my students, so who sins when there's poverty? right? It could be, we could say, okay, well, let's consider a mental health need or challenge a sin, but it's a sin because it's against God's will for wholeness and health and healing. But who is it that sins, right? And where do we go? Where does that kind of thinking helps us find solutions? But really, I think it's just that limited, very limited menu of the church that does not have a sense of what happens in families, the challenges that they're living, and has not wanted to move beyond that menu for a long time. And so even getting, I remember, in my time in Andover Newton Theological School, we did have Dr. Nancy Nienhuis religiously taught a course on intimate partner violence. But that was quite unique at that point. And I think it continues to be quite unique. So that notion that these family systems areas need to be part of the life of a seminary and part of the life of continued education of pastors. That's not there. We're not there yet.
Bernie, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, thank you. It's so wonderful to have you here, Professor Dávila. So thank you again for being here. And I just want to, as an outsider, I'm not Latino. I'm a lifelong Catholic. One of 8 children, spent 12 years in Catholic seminary in a religious order, and have my youngest brother has lived lifelong with schizophrenia. And my comment, this is kind of a roundabout way, and then I'll get back to it, is I'm not equating a person's experience of schizophrenia with what it means to be queer in the Catholic Church. But I do remember having a certain insight at when I believe that sinful statement was uttered by Cardinal Ratzinger, describing queer people as objectively disordered. It brought me back to my own training in seminary. There was like nothing in pastoral care classes, at least the Catholic seminaries I went to, that dealt with mental health. But it provided me a window into thinking, well, if I'm being seen or viewed as a queer person, as objectively disordered, somehow morally deficient, I had a very sideways glance into what my brother, who's now deceased, sadly, but a very devoted Catholic, the way in which church ministers treated him as mentally ill was kind of ignorance. Let's keep him out of the way. And I kind of felt, as a queer person, there was no pastoral care available, right, to me. And I remember people saying in seminary that, LGBT people, the only way the Catholic Church could really deal with queer people was through pastoral care. Well, there was nothing. There was nothing. It was just ignore, deny, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, especially within a Latino context, are there any denominations or churches that are kind of beginning to get it right, like beginning to address abandonment issues, isolation, the economic issues? Are there any models out there? And maybe even seminaries. I also teach a Pacific School of Religion, where I think, as in any seminary, the issue, and I don't teach in pastoral care, I teach in history, but what is out there? You mentioned Andover Newton's class, and I'm just curious to know, are there any models out there of groups that are doing, especially in the Latino context, are beginning to do it in a way that is moving the needle a bit?
We need a Latino James Martin. I think his work is really reaching a lot of ground. The idea of building bridges is, in fact, an idea of visibility. It's not full inclusion. And he's been really clever and clear that he is following the teachings, that everything he writes and everything he says follows the teachings of the Catholic Church. But by putting it in the framework of building bridges, you can't build a bridge to something you don't see. And you can't build a bridge to something you don't recognize as real. So his idea of building bridges to queer Catholic youth and queer Catholic families in general gives a visibility that wasn't there before. And when he's, it's lovely to follow when he's presented at different churches, because there's this sort of unicorn phenomenon that happens when he presents in churches that where members say like, but this didn't exist. Like, why are you telling us as a church to build bridges to a queer community if we don't have queer people in our church? Well, no, you've invisibilized them. If they're there at all, if they feel like they're still showing up, you've made them completely invisible, right? And I think it's the same thing with mental health care questions. You have the point at which perhaps in CCD classes or in religious education when they're children, that a child with special needs or a child with ADHD or whatever is attended to. But once that child grows up, there's nothing there for them, right? And especially if the mental health situation deteriorates to an addiction or deteriorates into violence or having a criminal record. Those become really complicated things for churches to manage, and we don't have experience in them. I remember doing a project, a doctor of ministry project, 2 of them with 2 different students, one a pastor and another a psychologist, where they wanted to explore the question of welcome in churches to people diagnosed with a sexual disorder, diagnosed with either pedophilia or having been charged and found guilty of aggression in some way or sexual violence, which have diagnoses, right? These are DSM-3R diagnoses. But the church is not ready to have that conversation, right? Of what kind of welcome, what kind of bridge do you build to someone who's been an offender, right? Who served their time, right? They've been there. They have a diagnosis. They committed a crime. They were in jail for the 6 years, 10 years, 12 years that they were told to serve by society. Now they come out and there is literally zero for them pastorally, zero. So these 2 students, no one would touch them with a 10-foot pole. So I said, sure, I'll direct your DMIN project. And so we talked about things like guarded welcome. In the church, we like to talk about radical welcome a lot because it's sexy and actually beautiful concept, right? When you're talking about migrations and things like that. Excuse me. But what we came up with was, maybe we need to develop different concepts of welcome in the church, where maybe we have a guarded welcome, where people who might pose a threat or have a particular conviction in their history are given some sort of welcome that still protects the rest of the population. But those are the conversations to be had, because again, you have so much of the population that's incarcerated right now, really incarcerated because of addiction or mental health challenge. And our churches are not prepared to receive them upon their release.
Thank you.
I wonder if anybody who's joined in the conversation and is listening has a question.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question to Professor Dávila. And the question I have is, do you think the churches are hesitant or reticent because they don't feel like they have the resources, the bandwidth? I mean, for example, I pastor a very small congregation in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And as a solo pastor, you're doing everything you can do to survive, just to stay alive and keep going. And I know there are bigger churches, and I know the Catholic Church is huge, but I wonder if sometimes churches and the leadership feels inadequate, or they feel like their congregations are not ready to have those discussions. And maybe the pastor does, the priest does, but does not feel that the body that they pastor is ready for that, or they don't feel like they have the resources.
That is definitely the case, I would say. But I would add a little bit more in the sense that they're already there, right? Just because we can't have or we don't feel prepared to preach a sermon on mental health care or mental wellness, or have the physical or financial resources to have a mental health care fair on a Sunday after church and have 10 providers come and speak 5 minutes each on what they could offer, what services they have available, etc. Doesn't mean that congregation of 50 or 60 families doesn't have someone impacted by this and that pain being made invisible. So we can certainly, for example, would it be possible? Dexter, you said it's a Baptist church?
No, I pastor a Seventh-day Adventist church.
Seventh-day Adventist.
Yeah, I
beautiful.
pastor a Seventh-day
Okay.
Adventist church. Yeah.
But I'm thinking, would it be possible for just a few resources to be sent for sermon prep that speak to healing, or even the raising? I mean, when we think of the raising of Lazarus, we have to preach on the raising of Lazarus or the raising of Jairus' daughter. Is it possible to speak there about wholeness and healing when mental health care, has taken a loved one, or a mental health crisis has led to a suicide of a loved one? Are we ready to preach that resurrection in a way that doesn't make the family invisible and their pain specific? The families keep going if they can, and some really remove. That's another piece that I hear a lot from in our support groups that I participate with. For some families, it's very painful to keep going if they're struggling with a particular crisis, not just so much because they feel invisible, but because they feel that they fall so short from the wholeness that the church professes.
Right.
Is offered.
Yeah.
Right. So perhaps more attention to brokenness as something that's welcome.
And that we all experience, right?
Yeah. And just because we don't
experience.
mention it, yeah. This week, I had to pray myself through a situation, and the anxiety wouldn't go away. So, short of breath, really the tightness, if you know what I'm talking about. Like I'm not sure I can take another step. This is really crippling. And I guess theologian me or pastor me said, you are being held. That very broken, very tight heart, very tight chest where you can't even take a deep breath because your body's reaction to anxiety is not letting you. That's being held. Just as broken as you are, you're being held. Right? Imagine saying that to a family going through a crisis, any crisis, but one that's been made invisible by society and the church. Right? Or to a queer youth, who is they're not only invisible in terms of dealing with their family dynamics and systems, but the church also makes them invisible in their queerness, again, as unique but interrelated phenomena, to be able to tell them that, right? And in liberation theology, we talk about saying to the poor that we got to take the poor down from the cross. It's a key concept of liberation theology. This is very similar. This is very similar. It's a poverty of spirit. And of health, right? There's clear biological and neurological pieces that are at work as well. So, so that's sort of at a lowest thing.
Yeah.
I think the mental health care fair would be a big one. And if your one church can't do it, this is where we begin forming coalitions. And you begin forming coalitions with other pastors, with other groups in your area, because what you do when you're involved, it's possible that the school system may be having a mental health fair, but when you get involved as a pastor, you legitimize it for them. And a lot of families don't feel like their search for mental health services is legitimized spiritually.
And in my mind, it's going a mile a minute here, MT. There's so much there. And if anybody has a question, please raise your hand or on mic. But I have come to believe that in churches, we don't know each other. We face forward. We witness worship. I'm trying to get people to be in the habit to pray out loud, which is not always comfortable. I'm an Episcopalian, so people pray to themselves. So you don't even have the benefit of knowing what the person next to you is praying about and is weighing on their heart. So it's almost like we attend church and church services are the least good places to get to know one another and get to know what people are going through, because we're engaged in a different direction, right? So how if you can as a priest in the Episcopal Church, you as a parent sitting in your congregation, hurting, what would be something very practical in that space that would let that would relieve some of that pressure? Like, that pressure that, like, for me, it catches right here sometimes, the anxiety pressure. What would be something that you went into a church and maybe you don't have to talk about it, and I want to get beyond the silencing. I'm not saying that to find a different way to silence, but what would be something that would just open up the space in church to bring your full self, right? Which is a self that most of us experience at some point that is struggling. And maybe we're not struggling for ourselves, but we're struggling because of a loved one. What would sort of be a word that could be shared that maybe would crack that open?
I don't hate necessarily to bring up Anna Newton. I just feel like that's my point of reference. But one thing that that we used to do periodically at our service, our community service, was have the same or very similar, not so much opening prayer, but sort of preamble to the opening prayer. And that was a welcome, and that welcome acknowledges brokenness, right? You are welcome here, as you are welcome here. If you left your bills on the table this morning and don't know where the money's going to come from for that, you are welcome here. If you fell in love and you don't know how to tell that person that you're in love with them, you're welcome here. And make it really concrete, right? Make that a very real space. And it can change up week by week, or you can leave the same text week by week. It could become a mantra for the community to themselves be humanized in that space, right? Not just think that I'm coming in and my brokenness has to stay at the door, or my humanity has to stay at the door, and it's only my divinity or my saintliness that comes in through the door. But some words of welcome that feel like a prayer, but really ground everyone's humanity. And then, I mean, if you're liturgical, being a Catholic, it makes that, beyond that, those words of welcome are really only other place for extemporaneous, besides the sermon, for extemporaneous kinds of inclusion to the language and the ritual is in the prayers of the faithful. But I think many other traditions can open up the community. So don't wait till the prayers of the faithful to have people pray out loud. Just ask openly, what would you like us to hold for you during our time together this morning? That can be the name of a person, or that people invite, and then you got to plant a few people, right? So just that are going to model what this looks like.
Exactly, yeah.
But that's one place where you begin clearing that chokehold on the chest for the person who says, I cannot let that broken side of my family show in this space.
Yeah. The myth of perfection, right?
Mm.
So I'm looking at folks to see if there's another question here. So I don't see another question right now, but I want to, so many levels to this, right? You're a theologian. You're trying to preach this in the public square as you're doing right now. You're living it. You're teaching it, you're trying to open it. And then it's all within the broader institution of the traditions that we move and have our being within. So if you were just wrap it up, I guess. I'm not coming up with a good question there in terms of at those three levels or more, where do you think you see a little glimmer of hope? At the personal, at the academic, teaching, etc., and then at the institutional, I guess is what I'm thinking.
I think at the institutional policy / even church level, I think this past year has been significant in making some strides on two fronts. One front, the public face of the mental health dimensions of the pandemic. I think that really has given a lot of freedom for people to have these discussions, because schools are having to talk about it. You get the notes, if you have a child in the public school system, you get the notes from the superintendent that they've added 3 more social workers to the school system to be able to check in with students. Additional training that was may be done for teachers and educators to be able to identify a family in need or a child in a particular need. So that, and then also with regard to the elderly, and that's not, you know, as a mother, I speak a lot about children and mental health care. We really can't forget about the elderly. That's another whole piece that is really important. And that was a demographic that really suffered a mental health impact from the pandemic. Again, the statistics of what the isolation with elderly who were in elderly homes or for whatever situation couldn't have family visit them for fear of contagion and fear of the illness, meant that for a lot of them, their dementia, their mental abilities, their capacity really diminished. If they didn't have dementia, it now expressed itself because of the pandemic. Those cases are well documented. And then if there was no dementia, you have an onset of geriatric depression. So that's another segment of the population whose mental health care and mental well-being was highlighted because of the pandemic. So that's one. And then on the other side, on the sort of racial justice, migrant justice side, is the Black Lives Matter protests and defunding, police defunding conversations that took place this past year, since a year ago. And for better or worse, it really began to highlight the inability of communities to have mental health care first responders. We have first responders for physical ailments and accidents. We have first responders for fire. We have first responders for criminal activity, but we don't have mental health care first responders. And most communities have what's called a crisis intervention unit. That really it is actually mainly for children, though mainly pediatric, though they do intervene in some adult cases. But it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient. And that came to the fore because we are now having conversations of where do city budgets go, right? And I'm not a full defund the police. I'm certainly not at that, but I do participate in those conversations for precisely that question. How do we contribute to a conversation about city budgets that has in mind, again, that really staggering statistic that 1 out of every 4 families has some experience with mental health crises and needs and challenges. Are we ready to, as communities, as cities? So that's a question of the common good, right? And in my writing, I associate a lot of this with the common good and with the role of the family and care for the family as part of the common good. That's something that our pastors could be cooperating in, and our seminaries could be cooperating in. So part of seminaries is perhaps, in public theology classes. Is this one of the things that's being examined? In preaching, is this one of the things that's being examined?
What do you think in the terms of you as a theologian? I know that intersects with what you were talking about. And on the personal level, where do you see the glimmers of hope?
Yeah, that is hard. That is hard. I think deciding to go public, and knowing that I have a platform, a very rich and very visible platform. So recognizing my privilege in speaking and writing about this. What's interesting is I've presented in the big conferences that you and I have gone to, and then I get the private messages, right? Like, thank you so much for speaking about this, and typically the person will speak about a family member who, and these are, very prominent theologians, but they do it privately. Send me a private message. Or someone who's lost someone to suicide. So that gives me hope. The fact that me taking the risk to go out and speak about this in public and encourage other thinkers and other activists to see where their privilege lies in being able to do something about this, and that energizes them, and at the same time frees them from perhaps that burden they would feel. It visibilizes them. It's incredible to me. See, now you got me started. We're going to be here forever. It's incredible to me, the compartmentalization we do with our lives. And you mentioned before that in our churches, we don't know each other. We're looking forward. Church attendance is a very individual thing in the US in most mainline denominations. That benefits very specific systems, right? That benefits the market. That benefits systems that don't want to be questioned. Because the moment you have a church where people begin to see each other as brother and sister, truly, as brother and sister in Christ, truly, and as brother and sister in X struggle, then that struggle doesn't stand a chance. So it behooves the powers and principalities to have a church where people don't know each other, right? That only serves one thing. And one of the ways that operates is in that compartmentalization. And we do it everywhere. We do it in our places of business. We do it in our jobs. We do it in our neighborhoods. We do it in our teams. If our children are playing sports, or if we are playing sports, we check parts of our suffering, or we check parts of our life for the sake of perhaps a more pleasant conversation, or a less contentious environment, or not imposing one's pain on another, not performing that critical work of mercy, which is to bear with one another's burdens, right? It's a work of mercy, but we don't translate that to this particular situation. And so when I present on this topic and I begin to hear from the scholars I love and respect, who begin to share with me their burdens. And again, what did I do? I'm not a clinician. I didn't fix the problem for them, but I visibilized it. I expressed solidarity. I made that solidarity very public. Those are things we can all do, right? It just takes a little conscientization to get there. But it makes a big difference for them. And to then maybe hope that through that, they begin to integrate that which the market, society, politics is way too eager to compartmentalize.
Wow. So I'm thinking we're gonna have to do a part 2 of this conversation at some point. So MT, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experiences, and in opening up a space in which people can think about visualizing the reality of people's lives, the truth, right? The fact that we are all living our whole selves and not have to negotiate and bring only part of ourselves to church and to our institution. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you, those of you who've participated in this today. We are going to stop the stream now. So, and this will stop being recorded, which is what Bernie can do. But thank you so much. My
pleasure.
Thank you,
Gratitude.
MD. Thank you.